Well, how are we going to find some gospel in the story of Naaman, Gehazi, and Elisha? That is our goal, always, to find somewhere in the text of the day some good news. I think a little background is probably in order here. The author of this particular book, or rather these books of 1st and 2nd Kings, has a pretty low view of the activities of the monarchs that ruled ancient Israel and Judah. If these were viewed as royal biographies, they would decidedly be the unauthorized version. 1st and 2nd Kings were written early in the period of time when the Israelites had been dragged off into slavery after the ignominious defeat they suffered at the hand of the Babylonians. And the books of 1st and 2nd Kings seek to answer a fundamental question. How did we wind up in this mess, and how are we going to get out of it? A tough question. Because the Israelites identified themselves as God's people, their loss of status can then be seen as the loss of God's favor. And as such, it represents a crisis of faith for them, one that must be answered. How did we get into this mess? And how are we going to get out of it? Or else they risk losing their identity as God's people. They want to know where they went wrong, and perhaps more importantly, they want to know when, if ever, God is going to act to fix it. So these are books for folks who want to know whether or not God still cares when they are frightened. If you have ever asked yourself the question, how did we get into this mess? This is a story for you. If you have ever asked yourself, is God still with me? This is a story for you. And if you have ever labored under the misapprehension that grace is some sort of a transaction, then this is really a story for you. Let's spend some time this morning with the characters in this story. I suspect we may see a bit of ourselves in them if we are honest. Now, Naaman is the first character we'll consider. He is an Aramaean. That means he is neither from Israel nor Judah. As they say where I grew up, he ain't from around here. He is decidedly not one of us. This is highlighted by the fact that he is a commander in the army. Had he been an Israelite or a Judean, he wouldn't have been both a leper and a commander. Why? Because everyone knows you wouldn't have entrusted the command of a battalion of troops to a leper. Now, sure, we understand today that leprosy is a disease, but that is not how the ancients understood it. Lepers are not just diseased, they are diseased because they are sinful. In other words, they had it coming for whatever they did. In a world where everything is attributed to cause and effect, it's a very simple way of understanding disease and really any misfortune that befalls you. The fact that he is both a leper and still a commander is another clue to us that something significant is going on, but perhaps more than that, it's simply a reminder he isn't from around here. And Naaman knows he's not from around here either. He knows it because when he approaches Elisha, he balks at how he is treated. He may be foreign, but he is still a commander, and he is not supposed to have to wait on an uppity Jewish prophet. So, as we read the story, you heard that Naaman got in a snit and decided that the rivers of Aram are perfectly suitable for bathing, and he is not interested in bathing in the Jordan. Finally, his servants approached him and pointed out the obvious. He could be right, or he could be well. His choice. It is an odd cure. He did exactly what the Lord required, and he was restored to health. Now, for the Jews reading this story, weeping by the waters of Babylon, this point would not have been lost. Living within the gracious will of God leads to wholeness. But as soon as I say that, I feel that I want to begin attaching disclaimers and caveats to it. And here's the main one. That is the outer limit of how far you and I can push this text this morning, that living within the will of God leads to wholeness. We can't go any further than that because we risk hubris if we try to explain God's healing. That is God's domain, and we do well to remember that. So if you are ill this morning, as much as I might love to tell you to go out and bathe 7 times in the Schuylkill and be made well, maybe don't do that. I can't say that, and you can't say that, and we can't try to predict and to own God's healing, because that puts us in the place of God, and that's not the place we belong. We need to be very careful of the healing claims of faith that we make, lest our mouths write checks that our own faith can't cash. But that isn't the end of Naaman's story. The story, you see, is less about Naaman's healing from leprosy than it is about what happens next. Naaman, who, remember, ain't from around here, then becomes a part of the people of God, and that is significant. He recognizes that he is standing in awe of Yahweh, who has made him whole, and he sees no alternative but to cast his lot with this Lord whose will brings wholeness. And so he requests 2 big loads of dirt to take with him and heads out to return to his home country, changed with a new faith, newly made whole. The world tilted on a different axis now because of his encounter with the Holy One of Israel. Now, what's significant about this healing, and one of the reasons I caution us not to try to apply it to others, is that it shows us what has changed in the story. Without the healing, there would be no change. If Naaman represents someone who has been changed and made whole by his encounter with the Holy, then Gehazi represents someone who has tragically missed the point. Gehazi ought to know better. Gehazi's a person of faith. Faith in the living God, the Holy One of Israel. He has all of the advantages of knowing the stories of God's deeds, and he still chooses the path that leads away from wholeness. Now, the ancient Israelites, weeping by the waters of Babylon, would surely have seen themselves in the person of Gehazi. They had all of the promises of faith. They knew all of the stories of God, and yet they still found themselves in captivity, wondering if God's favor has passed from them. If Naaman is the follower who says in joyful acclamation, "This is the Lord's doing and it is marvelous in our eyes," then Gehazi is the follower who says, "If this is the Lord's doing, then maybe the Lord can do a little more for me now." Now, no sooner does this transpire where Gehazi goes and takes payment. Elisha has, in humility, refused Naaman's offer of payment for the gifts that weren't his to accept payment for in the first place. Then Gehazi went racing after the mules, lickety-split, ready to cash in on what the Lord has done. And in the eyes of the author, this is a colossal mistake. Gehazi has turned his back on the blessings of the Lord he knows, seeking who knows what. Material gain, false security, take your pick. What it boils down to is his mistake is this: believing that the goodness of God is a commodity that can be bought and sold. It can't. God's love and favor are always free gifts, and God is always looking for new ways to share them. If we miss that, we miss the point. If you hear of a gospel that is transactional, it's not the gospel. If we are looking for a way that we can do something to procure God's grace, then it's not the good news. Because anytime we talk about anything that is anything other than the free gift of God, we have substituted our own understanding of grace for God's understanding of grace, and it's not the good news. Then there's one other person, that third person, Elisha. Elisha is neither the one seeking wholeness nor the one who has lost wholeness. He stands simply as a prophet speaking the word. He is pointing to God, to Yahweh, to remind the people who have lost their way that God has a way that is different and better and whole. And for those who seek to take part with God, God offers free grace. Elisha has been speaking the word of God, taking up the mantle of Elijah the prophet, calling for justice in a land that has forgotten what justice looks like, reminding us all that God's way is a way of wholeness. God's grace is not for sale and not ownable. And yet, in spite of all of that, is exactly what God wills for you and me and for those ancient Israelites. Now, to put a rather fine point on it, anytime we see a story as an allegory for ourselves, we have to ask who we are in the story. So as you heard that story this morning and were introduced to those characters, where do you see yourself? Are you seeking wholeness? Do you stand refusing to embrace wholeness because it means admitting that you are broken? Are you in need of penitence? Are you confused or hurting or fearful? Perhaps you are joyful this morning. There's a place for that in this story too. Or maybe you are tentative and fearful of how your faith will appear in a foreign world. I confess that on my best days, I am most of these things. I am, as you are, I suspect, someone who stands in need of grace, full of confused, conflicting motives, with fears and insecurities under the surface, as well as a goodly measure of joy. I suspect most of us are, most of the time. Nobody, you see, is purely Naaman in this story. Nobody is purely Gehazi. And frankly, nobody's purely Elisha, probably least of all Elisha himself. There's one more thing I need to say about this author of 1 Kings and their agenda. Now, theirs is not the only perspective on who God is and how God works in the world. It is a piece of the biblical witness. It's not the whole biblical witness. The whole biblical witness gives a version of God, a picture of God's grace that is greater than we can ever comprehend. when we take the whole witness of Scripture, the Psalms with all of their hope, Lamentations with all of its honesty, the Gospel with all of its promises, together they tell us of a God whose will for us is wholeness, whose promise for us is to never ever let us go. And they tell us as well of a God who, from eternity until this very moment, is always looking for willing participants in the grace that heals and restores. The church, you see, is just God's modern way of trying to do this. That's why we have to find some gospel, some good news in every story. The late Fred Craddock tells a story about a time he was in Los Angeles attending a meeting of the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature. Folks at the top of the field were gathered and sharing their work, allegedly deep insights into the nature of religion and God and the Bible. Craddock writes, "The papers were just extraordinary, minute of course, but extraordinary, strange and removed, but very, very good. We ran from paper to paper and banquet to banquet and conversation to conversation. In the course of one of those hasty journeys in the large hotel where we were, I encountered a woman, frantic with fear and high anxiety on her face. Under her arm, she clutched a black zippered Bible, and she said, 'Are you attending this meeting of Bible teachers?' I said, 'Yes.' She said, 'Is it open to anybody?' I said, 'Well, there are open sessions.' She said, 'Can I come in?' I said, 'What's your interest?' She said, 'I have wasted my life, and I want to become a Christian.'" Craddock reflects, there wasn't anything on that program for her. I didn't dare send her into Wittgenstein and all that. What was I going to do with this woman? I steered her off to one side to a refreshment stand, and for over an hour we talked. We talked about being a Christian. Before I left, I marked her Bible for her, some places where she could read upon her return home. Dr. Craddock went on to remark that it wasn't wrong that the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion hadn't arranged their programs for her. That wasn't wrong. It wasn't what they were there for. But, he cautioned, if no one would have spoken to her, there would have been no reason for the American Academy of Religion, no reason for the Society of Biblical Literature. And that brings me to my last point. It's not wrong for us to spend some time on a summer Sunday morning wandering around in the story of Naaman the Aramean. It is, after all, quite odd. And if we read our Bibles with any degree of sincerity, we surely must need some understanding of such texts. Nor is it wrong to struggle with the actions of Gehazi and the subsequent consequences. It's a good thing to seek understanding, so long as at the end of our questioning, we remember that it is a God of grace who quickens our search for the truth. And the truth we find is ultimately not a handful of aphorisms or corollaries gleaned from the pages of odd stories, but rather in Christian faith. The truth is a person. And it is through the lens of Jesus Christ that we who call ourselves Christians encounter this story and find meaning in it for our lives. Because at the end of the day, if we haven't heard the gospel, then we haven't met our reason for gathering. And since the gospel is always good news, if it's not good news, we aren't telling it right. Since the gospel is always good news, let us proclaim again the word of the Lord to us this day, that wholeness is what God wills for everyone, that no matter where we stand on the path to wholeness, God is always seeking us out. Let us proclaim the good news that God never gives up on the captives and is always ready to heal the brokenhearted. And finally, let us remember that there is no more sure way to meet that very God of grace than at this table where the place is already set for you and me, for anyone who is sorry for their sins and leans on the understanding of God that is founded in the grace of Jesus Christ. Remembering all of these things, let us come to the table.